I started noticing my packages disappearing almost immediately. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe the delivery driver's dropping things off at the wrong house, maybe a neighbor taking something by accident. But the pattern quickly became impossible to ignore. Little things vanished at first. A package of snacks here, a set of light bulbs there. Nothing huge, nothing that would break the bank, but it was the principle. I paid for those things, and they were supposed to be mine. Then it escalated. A week later, my brand new wireless headphones, the ones I had been saving up for, vanished from my porch. I walked outside, hoping maybe I had just misplaced the package, but there was nothing. The box was gone, and there were faint footprints in the dirt nearby, footprints that led in the direction of my neighbor's house. And that's when I saw her, HOA Confessionals. HOA Confessionals had always been the kind of person who treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She knew everyone's business, critiqued lawn decorations, monitored what got delivered to our doorsteps. She was the type who wore white gloves while inspecting her mailbox. I had heard stories from other neighbors, lost packages, petty fines, confrontations over nothing. She was a legend in her own mind, a walking, talking neighborhood watch mixed with a sense of entitlement that could only come from thinking she owned the streets. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining her tiptoeing across my porch, snatching packages, looking around to see if anyone was watching, probably laughing silently to herself. I didn't know how to confront it. If I accused her without proof, I'd look crazy. But if I did nothing, she'd keep taking things. I needed a plan, and I needed proof. The next day, I started paying attention to deliveries more closely. I noted every expected package, tracking the exact time it should arrive. I even started checking the delivery apps obsessively, as if staring at my phone would magically prevent theft. I set up a small security camera on my porch. Nothing fancy, just a motion-activated one that would start recording whenever someone approached. I hid it behind a potted plant so it wouldn't be obvious. My hands shook as I adjusted it, trying to hide my nerves under a calm, casual exterior. As the week went on, the suspense built. Every delivery felt like a ticking time bomb. My heart raced whenever the mail truck pulled up. I found myself peeking through blinds like a paranoid spy. Every shadow became suspicious. Every neighbor walking past was a potential thief. Humor helped me survive the tension. I joked to myself that maybe packages had grown legs and were sneaking off in the dead of night, or that a tiny team of squirrels was plotting a heist. But deep down, I knew it was her. Then it happened again. I was at work, checking the camera feed on my phone during a break. And there she was, HOA Confessionals, tiptoeing across my porch like she was sneaking past laser alarms in a movie. She grabbed a small package and walked away casually, holding it like it was a harmless trinket she had every right to take. I couldn't believe my eyes. My pulse was racing. I watched the replay several times, each time more furious and more incredulous. She had done this so casually, so confidently. It was almost cinematic, except it was infuriating. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about missing packages. It was about principle, about standing my ground, and about not letting someone manipulate a neighborhood into thinking they can do whatever they want. But how could I stop her without escalating things into an outright war with my HOA? Confrontation without evidence could backfire. I needed to be smart. I needed to catch her red-handed in a way that left no doubt. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, reading every article about catching package thieves. Some suggested motion sensors, some suggested dye packs, some suggested calling the police immediately. I scribbled notes, plotted out a plan, and tried to stay calm. My hands were shaking with excitement and anxiety. Tomorrow, I would start setting up my trap. Tomorrow, I would see if I could outsmart HOA Confessionals at her own game. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder. Did she really think she could keep getting away with it forever? The suspense gnawed at me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this continue. This was only the beginning, and soon, HOA Confessionals would learn that I wasn't someone to be trifled with. The next morning, I woke up with a mix of excitement and dread. Last night's footage had replayed in my head countless times. HOA Confessionals, tiptoeing across my porch, glancing around like she thought no one could see her. The boldness, the audacity, it made my blood boil, but it also sparked something else, determination. I couldn't let her get away with this again. I had to catch her in a way that left no room for denial. I started my day by checking the delivery schedule obsessively. I wrote down every expected package, noting times and what exactly would be arriving. I even tracked the delivery trucks using their apps, staring at the moving dots on my screen like a hawk. It probably looked ridiculous to anyone who might have been watching, but I didn't care. Every second mattered. As the morning passed, I kept glancing out my window. Every neighbor who walked past suddenly became suspicious. Even the mailman felt like a potential accomplice. My paranoia was growing, but it wasn't unfounded. I had seen the evidence. She had a pattern, a rhythm, a confidence that suggested she had done this before. The suspense built with every passing minute. Would she come today? Would she strike while I was in the middle of breakfast, or worse, while I was away? By noon, a small package arrived. My heart jumped as I watched it land on the porch. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to be engrossed in work while actually keeping my eyes glued to the camera feed. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes crawled by, and then I saw her, HOA moving slowly across the street. My pulse quickened. She paused at my fence, looking around. My stomach twisted. She had that look on her face, the one I knew all too well, the thrill of getting away with something she shouldn't. I grabbed my phone and quietly called a neighbor, someone I trusted, just to have a backup witness. "Hey, can you keep an eye on my porch?" I whispered, trying to sound casual. They agreed, curious but intrigued. I could feel the tension building as the minutes ticked by. Every second felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation. Then it happened. She reached my porch, slowly bending down to pick up the package. My camera captured every movement. I could see her fingers brushing over the box, the careful way she lifted it, making sure not to make a sound. I felt a surge of adrenaline. My hands shook as I prepared to act, but I had to stay hidden. If she suspected I was watching, the entire plan would be compromised. For a moment, everything froze. The air seemed heavy, the suspense almost unbearable. She stood there holding the package, glancing over her shoulder as if she had sensed my eyes on her. Then she turned and walked away, humming softly, completely unaware that the camera had recorded every second. I let out a silent sigh, both relieved and furious. She had taken it again, but now I had undeniable proof. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I watched the footage over and over, analyzing every detail. I studied her approach, her timing, her habits. It became clear that she had a pattern: late mornings, always when most people were distracted, always quick, precise, and confident. The suspense of waiting for the next delivery was almost unbearable. I knew I had to escalate my plan. This was no longer about catching her after the fact. It was about preventing future thefts, and maybe even giving her a lesson she wouldn't forget. As evening approached, I started researching different methods online. Some were simple: cameras, motion sensors, security signs. Others were more creative, like invisible ink markers, dye packs, or harmless traps that left a mark on the thief. The idea of a dye trap made me grin nervously. It was perfect, dramatic, undeniable, and humiliating enough to send a message without involving the police yet. The suspense of imagining her reaction gave me chills. By nightfall, I had mapped out a plan. I would set a package with the dye trap in the exact spot she couldn't resist. I would monitor her movements closely, stay hidden, and let her make the first move. The anticipation was almost unbearable. My pulse raced just thinking about it. I couldn't help but imagine the moment the trap activated, her surprise, confusion, and eventual panic. It would be glorious. As I lay in bed that night, my mind raced with possibilities. I imagined every scenario. What if she noticed the camera? What if she got suspicious? What if the trap failed? The suspense gnawed at me. I realized I hadn't just started a plan. I had entered a game of strategy, patience, and nerves. Tomorrow would be the real test. Tomorrow, I would see if I could outsmart HOA at her own game. And as sleep finally started to pull me under, one thought kept me awake. She didn't know what was coming. She had no idea that the next delivery might be the last time she got away with it. The suspense hung over me like a storm cloud, and I couldn't wait for it to break. The next morning, I woke up with a mix of excitement and nerves. Last night's plan had been rattling in my mind all night. The footage of HOA tiptoeing across my porch over and over played like a horror comedy loop in my head. She was bold, confident, and completely oblivious to the fact that I was already plotting her downfall. Today, I was ready to take things to the next level. I started by gathering supplies for the dye trap. It wasn't complicated, but it had to be perfect. A small package, some harmless but effective marking dye, tape, and a few simple sensors to trigger it when the package was moved. I set everything up on my kitchen table, arranging it like I was some kind of mad scientist preparing for an experiment. The suspense made my hands shake as I checked every detail. If anything went wrong, the plan could fail and she could keep getting away with it. As I prepared the trap, I kept replaying her previous moves in my mind. She always came late in the morning, walked quickly, but carefully, never looking directly at the camera. She had an instinct for avoiding suspicion, which made the next part critical. I couldn't just leave the package lying around in the open. It had to look completely ordinary, irresistible even, while remaining in the perfect spot for the trap to work. By late afternoon, I felt ready. I wrapped the package carefully, making sure the dye device was hidden inside. It was small, almost undetectable, but powerful enough to leave a mark. I laughed nervously at the thought. This wasn't just about catching her anymore, it was about sending a message. The kind of message that she would never forget. I imagined her frustration, her confusion, the panic in her eyes as the dye revealed her crime. The suspense made my pulse race. I carried the package to the porch, my heart hammering. I placed it exactly where she had always picked up deliveries, making it look natural. Every detail mattered, orientation, angle, even the little shadow that would make it look untouched. I double-checked the sensors and camera angles. Everything had to work perfectly. Failure was not an option. The suspense of waiting, knowing she could arrive at any moment, was almost unbearable. Once the package was set, I retreated to my favorite hiding spot in the living room. From there, I could see the porch and the path she always took. I felt like a sniper waiting for the perfect shot, except instead of a weapon, I had a harmless but humiliating trap. The minutes stretched into hours. Every passing car, every pedestrian made my stomach twist. Was that her? No, just a neighbor walking their dog. Was that her? No, just the mailman finishing his route. The suspense was delicious and terrifying all at once. As evening approached, I checked the camera again. No movement, no sign of her, but I couldn't relax. She might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment, as she always did. I imagined her perspective, a perfectly ordinary neighborhood, a package sitting on a porch, no one around. She probably thought it was just another easy score, completely unaware of the trap waiting for her. The thought made me grin, but it also made my heart race. In just a few hours, everything could change. Then I started planning contingencies. What if she noticed the package and hesitated? What if she triggered it partially? What if the dye malfunctioned? The suspense twisted tighter with every scenario. I went over every possible outcome, trying to prepare for them all. I even rehearsed my reaction, laugh quietly, record everything, stay calm no matter how dramatic her reaction. I needed to stay composed. The moment she discovered the dye, the game would change instantly. Finally, night fell. The package was still there, perfectly placed, waiting. I sat in the dark, watching through the camera, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. I imagined her approaching in the morning, picking it up, and the trap activating flawlessly. The suspense was almost unbearable. I couldn't help but whisper to myself, half laughing, half anxious, "Tomorrow, hoakaren, your luck runs out." As I turned off the lights and lay in bed, I realized something. This was more than catching a package thief. It was about control, about standing my ground, about proving that clever planning could beat bold arrogance. The suspense hung over me like a storm cloud, and I couldn't sleep, knowing that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The question lingered in my mind. Would the trap work perfectly, or would she somehow outsmart me? The anticipation was excruciating. One thing was certain, tomorrow I would find out. Morning arrived, but sleep had barely touched me. My mind raced with every possible scenario. The package was still on the porch, sitting there innocently, waiting for her. I paced around the living room, glancing out the window every few seconds. The suspense was almost unbearable. Would she come early like she usually did, or was she going to change her routine? Every passing shadow, every sound outside made my heart jump. I double-checked the camera feed and the sensors on the package. Everything was in place. The dye trap was armed, harmless but effective, ready to mark whoever picked it up. My hands shook slightly as I tested the connections one last time. The adrenaline was surging, a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was it, the moment of truth. The suspense was unbearable, but I couldn't leave. I had to watch. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. I made coffee, but my hands were too jittery to drink it. I kept telling myself that patience was key, that she would come, and when she did, everything had to go perfectly. I imagined her walking down the street, a little too confident, unaware that the house she considered an easy target had become a trap. The anticipation was like a knot in my stomach, tightening with every tick of the clock. Then I saw her. At first it was just a glimpse of her red jacket as she walked past my neighbor's yard. My heart raced. She paused, looking in the direction of my porch, and my pulse nearly stopped. She was considering the package. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my body closer to the window, careful not to make a sound. Every instinct screamed at me to stay calm, to let her make the first move. Hoakaren approached slowly, cautiously. The suspense built with every step. She glanced around, checking for witnesses or cameras, although she didn't see the one I had hidden. She crouched slightly, fingers brushing the package. I could see the hesitation in her movements, the instinctive pause before taking what didn't belong to her. It was like watching a character in a suspense movie, only this was real, and I was holding the remote to the ultimate reveal. My heart pounded in my chest as she finally picked up the package. The die trap activated instantly. I heard the faint hiss of the mechanism from the camera feed and saw the invisible dye spray onto her hands and clothes. She froze, her face a mixture of confusion, shock, and disbelief. For a moment, she didn't move, as if she was trying to process what had just happened. The suspense was almost too much for me to bear. Then she started frantically wiping at the invisible dye, panic spreading across her face. I could barely contain my laughter, but I stayed hidden. She looked around, realizing that the stain was spreading, that it was on her clothes and hands, and there was no way to hide it. My neighbors were beginning to notice, whispering and pointing. She looked directly toward my house, and I could feel her fury radiating like heat through the camera. The suspense reached a peak. What would she do next? Would she confront me, scream, or run? Hoakaren hesitated, then finally dropped the package on the porch and backed away, trying to compose herself. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering, knowing that the evidence was recorded. She glanced at the camera's direction, suspicion flashing in her eyes, but she couldn't see it. She didn't know she had just stepped into the perfect trap. The suspense was nearly unbearable, and I felt a thrill of victory mingled with relief. For the rest of the morning, she lingered nearby, muttering under her breath, her movements anxious and jittery. I watched every step, making notes for what I would do next. The suspense didn't end after the trap worked. Now it was about what came next, how she would react, how the neighborhood would respond, and how I would confront her without escalating things too quickly. By afternoon, the package was empty, and the evidence on her hands was undeniable. The suspense of waiting for the fallout was almost worse than the trap itself. I could imagine the confrontation building, her anger boiling, and the dramatic scene that would soon unfold. This was more than just a victory. It was the beginning of a story that everyone in the neighborhood would notice. As I finally leaned back in my chair, letting the tension ebb slightly, I realized something important. The game had changed. Hoakaren wasn't just a problem anymore. She had become a character in a story that I was controlling. And the suspense, the anticipation, the thrill of the unknown, it was only going to grow from here. The next steps would decide everything. Tomorrow, I thought, would be even more intense. The trap had worked, but how she responded would determine the rest of this battle. The suspense hung over me like a storm cloud, and I couldn't wait to see it break. I couldn't believe what I was seeing on the camera. Hoakaren was completely frozen, holding the package as if it had suddenly turned into a live grenade. The invisible dye from the trap had already marked her hands and sleeves, and she had no idea how to fix it. She looked down at herself in horror, her face a mixture of disbelief and fury, and I had to bite my lip to stop myself from laughing out loud. The suspense was almost unbearable. Every second felt stretched like taffy. She frantically rubbed at her hands, then realized the stain had spread to her shirt and jacket. Her movements became more frantic, almost cartoonish, as she tried to wipe it off with the edge of the package, with leaves, with whatever she could find nearby. It was like watching a slow-motion comedy horror scene, and yet the suspense kept my stomach twisted. What would she do next? Would she run, scream, or confront me right then and there? I stayed perfectly hidden, watching through the camera, my heart pounding. Neighbors were starting to notice her awkward flailing. Some peeked from their windows, whispering to each other. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief. She was becoming the center of attention, and I could almost hear the whispers traveling down the street. The suspense wasn't just in what she would do, but in how the neighborhood would react. Would anyone intervene, or would they just watch as the situation unfolded? HOA Karen finally dropped the package in frustration, muttering under her breath and glaring toward my house. I could feel the intensity of her stare even from behind the screen. It was like the calm before a storm, the kind of suspense that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. She didn't see the camera, didn't realize her every move was being recorded, and yet her panic and rage were more than enough to tell the story. She started packing near my porch, hands stained with dye, muttering accusations to herself. Who did this? Who would dare? I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. She had no idea how clever the setup was. The suspense was electric. I knew she was about to make a mistake. All it would take was one wrong move, one overreaction, and the truth would be undeniable. And then she did it. She reached toward my fence, attempting to clean her hands on a bush, which only smeared the dye further. I could see her panic rising with every movement. She realized this wasn't going away quickly. This mark would be obvious to anyone who saw her. The suspense of watching her realize that her reputation, and maybe her dignity, was at stake made my pulse race. I was witnessing the perfect blend of fear, frustration, and helplessness. The neighbors began emerging cautiously, drawn by the commotion. Some were trying to act casual, others couldn't resist watching. The suspense now shifted from my perspective to theirs. Who would speak up, who would laugh, who would finally confront her? I stayed hidden, letting the drama unfold naturally. Every twitch of her hand, every frantic wipe of her jacket was more satisfying than I had imagined. Finally, she seemed to realize that no amount of wiping would hide the evidence. She stood there, hands stained, clothes marked, staring at the porch as if trying to summon the courage to do something. I held my breath, wondering, would she confront me? Would she storm inside and cause a scene, or would she retreat in humiliation? The suspense was unbearable. Then, almost theatrically, she turned and stomped down the street, muttering angrily under her breath. The neighbors were staring, whispering, and I could almost hear them laughing quietly to themselves. The suspense had reached its peak. HOA Karen had been caught in her own arrogance, exposed without me having to step outside. My pulse was still racing, but the satisfaction was incredible. I knew this moment would echo through the neighborhood for days, maybe weeks. As I watched her disappear around the corner, a mix of relief and triumph washed over me. The trap had worked perfectly. The suspense of waiting, of imagining every possible reaction, had been worth it. But I also knew this wasn't the end. HOA Karen would respond, and the next confrontation could be even more dramatic. The suspense hung over me like a storm cloud, thrilling and tense, promising that the story wasn't over yet. I leaned back, letting out a quiet laugh, and whispered to myself, "This is only the beginning, Karen. The next move is yours." The suspense lingered in the air, thick and intoxicating, setting the stage for the fallout that was about to shake the neighborhood. The next morning, I knew it was coming. HOA Karen wasn't the type to let something like this slide quietly. Her hands were still marked from the dye trap, her jacket smeared, and her pride shattered. I could feel the tension in the air even before she reached my door. Every step she took down the street echoed in my mind, each one a drumbeat of suspense. Today, she would confront me, and I didn't know if it would be calm, explosive, or utterly chaotic. My heart pounded as I opened the door slightly, peeking out to see her storming up the walkway. Her face was red, a mix of anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. She didn't even glance at the camera hidden near the porch. Her focus was laser-sharp, me. The suspense hit a peak I hadn't felt before. This was the moment where everything could change. HOA Karen didn't waste a second. She started yelling before I could even say a word. "What did you do? This is outrageous. How dare you?" Her voice cracked with fury. She waved her dyed hands at me like evidence of a crime I hadn't committed. The neighbors had begun peeking out their windows, drawn to the commotion. I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm, letting her rage make her look more ridiculous while I stayed composed. The suspense of how far she would go was electrifying. I pointed subtly toward the camera, letting the footage speak for itself. "I didn't do anything," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're on camera, Karen, every move you made yesterday and today." The suspense tightened as I watched her face change from anger to shock, then to a mixture of denial and panic. She realized she had been caught, and now the confrontation was fully public. Her voice wavered as she tried to twist the story. "This is harassment. You can't do this. I'll call the HOA. This is illegal," she sputtered, flailing her hands. The The suspense kept building. I had all the evidence I needed, but I also had to stay careful. If I escalated too quickly, she could spin it against me. The drama was palpable, thick in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. I remained calm, letting her words bounce off me. "The HOA will see the footage too," I said quietly. "Everything you did is recorded. It's all there. You can deny it, but it won't change what happened." The suspense now shifted. The question wasn't whether she had been caught, but how she would react. Would she storm off, create a scene, or try to manipulate the situation further? Each possibility made my pulse race. Hoa Karen's frustration turned to desperation. She waved her hands, trying to rub off the dye, but only smeared it more. Neighbors were beginning to whisper and point. The suspense was nearly unbearable as I watched her unravel. She looked around, realizing that this confrontation wasn't just between us. It was happening in full view of the neighborhood. Her arrogance was crumbling, replaced by a frantic, almost comical panic. Then she stepped closer, voice trembling, almost shouting. "You think this is funny? You think you can just embarrass me in front of everyone?" The suspense hit another level. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out a way to turn the situation in her favor, but she had nothing. The evidence was too clear. The dye on her hands, the camera footage, the timing of every stolen package, everything pointed directly to her. I finally leaned slightly forward, letting a calm smile play across my face. "It's not funny, Karen, it's proof. You've been taking packages and now everyone knows." The suspense hung heavy as she realized she couldn't deny it anymore. The neighbors were watching, whispering, and some even laughed quietly. The tension was electric, almost theatrical, as the confrontation reached its peak. Hoa Karen backed away, fuming and flustered. She muttered threats about the HOA and legal action, but it was clear she had lost control of the narrative. The suspense didn't end there. I knew she could still try to escalate, but for now, I had the upper hand. The trap had worked, the evidence was undeniable, and the confrontation had exposed her arrogance in front of the entire neighborhood. As she finally stormed off, muttering under her breath, I let out a quiet laugh. The suspense lingered, but relief and triumph washed over me. This confrontation was only part of the story, and I knew the fallout would ripple through the neighborhood. Hoa Karen had been caught, embarrassed, and exposed, but the suspense promised there would still be more drama to come. The next few days felt like walking through a storm. Hoa Karen's outburst had left ripples through the neighborhood. I could sense the tension as soon as I stepped outside. Neighbors were whispering, some laughing quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Every glance felt like a reminder of the trap's success, and yet the suspense lingered. What would happen next? Would she try to retaliate, or would the neighborhood finally see the truth? I walked down the street, waving cautiously to neighbors who had been watching the drama unfold. A few approached, curious and smiling. "We saw what happened," one neighbor said, chuckling. "That was incredible. She didn't see it coming." The suspense of interacting with the people who had witnessed the chaos firsthand was thrilling. I could feel the story spreading like wildfire, each retelling adding tension to the next chapter of this neighborhood saga. Hoa Karen, meanwhile, had gone quiet in public, but I knew better. Silence from her didn't mean surrender. It meant plotting. I could feel it in the air, a lingering tension every time I saw her glance toward my house. The suspense was a constant pulse, a reminder that even though the trap had worked, the story wasn't over. I had won a battle, but the war for neighborhood peace was still in motion. Then came the announcement that set everyone on edge, the next HOA meeting. She had officially called for a discussion about harassment and harassment accusations, though everyone who had seen the footage knew the truth. The suspense built as I prepared to attend. Would she make a scene again? Would the HOA side with her, or would my evidence finally be acknowledged? The thought made my stomach tighten. The meeting day arrived, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Neighbors were whispering, seats were filling, and Hoa Karen arrived in her usual dramatic fashion. Red-stained hands hidden awkwardly, she carried herself with a mix of arrogance and desperation. The suspense was palpable. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the confrontation to erupt. Hoa Karen wasted no time. She started speaking, attempting to spin her story, accusing me of creating a hostile environment and exaggerating incidents. The room grew tense as the drama unfolded. Her gestures were frantic, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. The suspense reached a peak. Would anyone side with her, or would the evidence speak louder than her words? I calmly requested to present my footage. The room fell silent as the security camera video played, showing her taking the packages, the dye trap activating, and her panicked reactions. Gasps filled the room, and whispers rippled through the audience. The suspense was almost unbearable as I watched HOA Karen's face shift from anger to shock, then to humiliation. She realized her attempts to manipulate the narrative had failed spectacularly. Neighbors started talking among themselves, quietly at first, then more openly. "I can't believe she actually did this," one neighbor said. "I thought she was exaggerating." The suspense grew with every whispered conversation. The room was alive with tension, each person processing the evidence and the audacity of HOA Karen's behavior. The drama was tangible, thick in the air. HOA Karen's desperation became obvious. She tried to argue, to distract, to deflect, but the evidence was undeniable. Her red-stained hands and frantic attempts to clean them were visible in the footage. The suspense now shifted to the room itself. Would the HOA finally take action, or would she somehow twist this in her favor? The tension made every second feel like an eternity. Finally, the HOA chair addressed the room, acknowledging the evidence and stating that appropriate action would be taken. HOA Karen's protests fell flat, her arguments drowned out by the reality captured on camera. The suspense broke into relief. Justice was being served. Neighbors murmured in approval, some laughing quietly at the absurdity of it all, others nodding in satisfaction. As I walked home that evening, a sense of triumph mixed with lingering suspense washed over me. The neighborhood knew the truth, the HOA had taken notice, and HOA Karen's arrogance had been exposed. Yet the story wasn't completely over. The suspense of what she might do next, whether she would escalate privately or simply sulk, hung over me like a dark cloud. One thing was certain. She had been outsmarted, humiliated, and finally put in her place. The events of the past few days had turned my quiet neighborhood into a stage for drama, suspense, and a little poetic justice. I couldn't help but smile at the thought that sometimes clever planning and patience were all it took to expose the truth. The suspense lingered, yes, but now it was tinged with victory and anticipation for the inevitable aftermath. Finally, the day arrived when things started to feel like they were settling down. HOA Karen had been humiliated in front of the neighborhood, the HOA had acknowledged the evidence, and most importantly, my packages were safe, for now. But even with her defeat, a small part of me stayed on edge. After all, she was HOA Karen. Unpredictability was her specialty, and suspense lingered like a storm cloud, reminding me that this wasn't over completely. I started the morning with a cautious walk to my porch, checking that everything was in order. The dye stains from the previous incident had faded from view, but the memory of them lingered vividly. Neighbors smiled and waved as I passed by, some giving quiet nods of approval, others shaking their heads with amusement at the chaos that had unfolded. It was clear that the story had traveled fast, and my little victory had become part of neighborhood lore. The suspense of how long it would last added an edge to each interaction. HOA Karen tried to maintain her composure in public. She walked past my house with a tight-lipped expression, pretending nothing had happened. But the subtle cues were obvious to anyone paying attention. Her hurried steps, the nervous glance toward my porch, the avoidance of eye contact. Even in defeat, the suspense of her next move hung in the air. I couldn't relax completely, knowing she might attempt something small, petty, or absurd at any moment. A few days later, the HOA sent a formal notice confirming that any future incidents would result in strict action against her. The tension in the neighborhood eased slightly, and the suspense shifted from fear to satisfaction. People joked quietly about the dye incident, laughed about her panicked expressions, and shared the story in hushed, gleeful tones. It was surreal to see the mix of relief, humor, and lingering anticipation in everyone's reactions. HOA Karen predictably tried to save face. She began dropping passive-aggressive comments in the neighborhood chat, hinting at perceived injustices and exaggerating her side of the story. But everyone who had seen the footage knew the truth. Her attempts to stir drama fell flat, which only added to the suspense. How long would she keep trying before she realized it was pointless? I watched quietly, savoring the quiet control I now had over the narrative. One afternoon, a neighbor came over with coffee, laughing as they recounted the great dye heist to me. "I still can't believe she actually did that," they said. You've officially become a legend in the neighborhood. The suspense now felt more playful than tense. The dramatic showdown with Hoa Karen had passed, but the memory of her panic and the uncertainty she had brought lingered, making the story even more satisfying. As I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized how much patience, planning, and a little cleverness had paid off. The suspense, the waiting, the uncertainty, all of it had created the perfect conditions to expose Hoa Karen without putting myself at risk. It wasn't just about catching a thief anymore. It was about standing up for myself and reclaiming a sense of peace in my own home. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Packages were delivered safely, children played on the sidewalks without fear of interference, and conversations about Hoa Karen shifted from worry to amusement. Yet every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of her lurking in the distance, hands clean this time, expression tight, and a small thrill of suspense would run down my spine. Even in defeat, she remained a reminder of the chaos she once caused. Finally, I felt a sense of closure. The dye trap had worked perfectly, the evidence had been undeniable, and the neighborhood had collectively seen the truth. Hoa Karen had been exposed, her power diminished, and my packages were safe once and for all. The suspense of wondering what she might do next had faded into a satisfying memory. I leaned back on my porch, sipping my coffee, and allowed myself a quiet laugh. This whole experience had taught me something important. Clever planning, patience, and a little humor could turn even the most frustrating situation into a victory. The suspense, once nerve-wracking, had become a source of triumph. And as I looked around the peaceful neighborhood, finally free from her meddling, I knew that sometimes the best way to deal with a problem is to outsmart it completely. Hoa Karen would remember this lesson for a long time. And so peace returned, packages were safe, and the story of the great dye trap became part of neighborhood legend. Suspense, drama, and a little ingenuity had turned a frustrating ordeal into a satisfying tale of justice served, and one I would never forget. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.